So yeah, just to welcome everybody to this Collective Tenure Rights for REDD+ webinar. This is the first webinar organized in the framework of the REDD+ and Forest Governance Discussion Group. So for us, it's a very exciting moment actually in this today in this event. So also bear with us if we're a bit excited, and if we might have some minutes of delays that you can see, or some tumbling of the voice. So here, the person who's speaking here, I'm Serena Fortuna. I'm the FAO REDD+ forestry officer. This moment I'm sitting here in headquarters in Rome, and I'm, among other things, I'm also coordinating the work of the REDD+ team in governance, including tenure and other things that I will not enter in detail now. But the most related to this is the coordination of the governance issues. Next to me here, there is Amanda Bradley, who is our expert on tenure. You will hear more from her during this webinar. As of yesterday, we had we saw that there were approximately 200 people interested in this webinar. It's very nice to see that the number of participants is growing, and also that our panelists and our commentators are joining us today, and really look forward for very engaging discussions. So also to give a bit more time to the people to enter the virtual room, I really would like to thank various group of people. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers. We have 3 very interesting case studies that are going to be presented today during this session. We also have various commentators of a very high level standards, experts on tenure and other related issues that are going to provide us with reflection and inputs during this hour and a half that we have together. Of course, I need to thank also the UN REDD donors. As we were mentioning, this webinar is part of as one of the activities of the discussion group on REDD+ and forest governance, but it's basically made possible thanks to the UN REDD donors. Those are Norway, the EU, Denmark, Spain, Japan, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. So we're very thankful for the work that we can do thanks to them. Of course, I would like to thank all the participants that are here, and all of you for the interest that you had in this topic. And finally, last but not least, as we always say, the colleagues that organize this important session. So again, Amanda here next to me, but also Francesca Felicani sitting in Panama, Alice, our colleague from UN REDD in charge of knowledge management, many other things, and Ken Rosenbaum also, that together with Amanda and Francesca is the co-moderator of the discussion group on forest governance and REDD+. So again, thank you very much to everybody. So the agenda, as you might have seen when you registered in this session, the agenda is very packed. So we really would like to start diving. Here, yes, okay. It was Alice. Thanks for muting me. And I'm joking. So yeah, we would really like to jump and dive into this information exchange. Before doing so, I'll just pass the word a minute or so to Alice to give some technical kind of recommendation on also how to interact in this session. We just really want to have questions so that we can also provide you with additional information and having as a dialogue. So Alice, the floor is to you for technical informations. Thanks. So jumping directly into the agenda now, I think I would like to give the floor to Francesca Felicani Robles. She's our forestry officer specialized in REDD+ legal issues, currently based in Panama, but soon to come back here to headquarters to help global coverage. So Francesca, up to you for the quiz.
Good morning, good afternoon, dear participants. So as Serena said, let's just start with a short quiz. We'll have like 4 questions related to collective tenure rights to set up the stage and try to have a feeling of our level of knowledge on the matter. So I will pose the question: and you will have 4 options as answers. I can see that you already have the question on the screen, so let's start with the first one. So approximately what % of carbon is stored in indigenous territories around the world? Between 3 and 5%, 10 and 15%, 17 and 20, or 75, 80%. So please just write down your answer, and I'll be able to check immediately if you get the right one. Okay, I can see that most of the people found the right answer related to the first question, which was C, between 17 and 20%. I see that you're going fast, so I'm going fast as well. Let's look at the second question. Indigenous peoples and local communities have formal legal claim to what percentage the world's land area? 2%, 8%, 20%, or 45%? I can see that most of you, well, think that the right answer is the third one, but in fact, it's the second one, so 88%. The third question, what % of the living languages in the world today are at risk of extinction? Let's see what's the right answer. Great, so the D is the right answer. I can see that most of you answered that one. So let's go for the very last question. Women own approximately what % of land? 15, 25, 35, or 42? Let's look for the answers. I think most of you get the right one, so it's the first one, the answer, the right one. So 15%. Thank you very much. And have a good continuation.
Thanks, Francesca. Stay with us, don't go away. The rest of the, we need you for the rest of the webinar. But thanks so much to put some thrill and excitement in at the beginning of the webinar. I hope that the majority of the participants found this interesting. Me, myself, I actually had a doubt in a couple of questions, so I was very happy and lucky to be next to Amanda, who's going to give us additional information now on collective tenure rights and REDD+. Amanda Bradley is our specialist on forest tenure, gender, and indigenous people. Here in the REDD+ team in FAO. So Amanda, your 7 minutes are counting now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Serena. Good afternoon and or good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. And without further ado, I'll start here. How does it go? Oh, thank you. So just to introduce, for those who may not be so familiar, collective tenure rights are tenure rights that are held by a group rather than an individual, and they are linked to an area of commons used and managed jointly. Collective tenure rights may include different types of models such as indigenous territories, community forestry, or recognized customary tenure rights. It's estimated that as many as 2.5 billion people rely on collective tenure rights worldwide. And the tropical forests in the territories of indigenous peoples and local communities contain at least 17% of the above ground carbon stored in tropical forests. This is data from RRI. There are many advantages of collective tenure rights towards sustainable development, for instance, in terms of poverty reduction, biodiversity conservation, and water resources protection. So my presentation is based on a forthcoming paper, which is focusing on the contribution of collective tenure rights towards mitigating climate change, with attention to the links with national REDD+ strategies and nationally determined contributions. So this paper has been under development since the middle of last year, and it's really benefited a lot from existing research and from many different researchers and institutions, and also the input of experts in the area of tenure, some of whom are joining us today, and I'm very grateful to all of that input. I would also like to mention that the approach that we're using in putting this paper and the presentation together is guided by the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure, which is an internationally endorsed framework for good practice on tenure. So I'd now like to run through some of the rationales or possible justifications for investing in collective tenure rights. The first rationale is that secure collective tenure rights are strongly linked with reduced deforestation and forest degradation. So it's somewhat difficult to establish scientifically and globally the link between secure tenure and better forest conditions. But in some specific countries, there's sort of irrefutable evidence on this. And the examples of Brazil and Nepal have been raised especially, and we'll hear a bit more about Nepal later in the session. Basically, when collective tenure rights are more secure, then there tends to be better enforcement of forest regulations. The second rationale relates to cost effectiveness of investing in collective tenure rights. It's been shown that investments in collective tenure rights generally have comparatively low costs and high benefits. There are reduced transaction costs since larger areas tend to be titled. Local people who live in or near the forest often have a very deep knowledge of its systems and dynamics, and they often have a sense of community and joint responsibility. And when they have secure tenure, this sense of ownership is even stronger. So the third rationale that we wanted to present was on the fact that indigenous peoples and local communities manage huge amounts of land and carbon. RRI's analysis, as mentioned in the quiz, shows that more than 17% of total carbon stored in forests, 17% of the total carbon stored in forests was in the territories of indigenous peoples and local communities in the 69 countries that they surveyed. Fourth rationale relates to the benefits for biodiversity and ecosystem services. This links to how much of the world's genetic resources are inside indigenous peoples and local communities' territories and the effectiveness of their traditional management systems. Next is the fact that access to climate change finance may be enhanced when countries show more attention to collective tenure rights. This is a somewhat more practical reason, perhaps. And the sixth reason or rationale is related to livelihoods. So the fact that securing collective tenure rights can lead to improved livelihoods and food security. So as mentioned, more than approximately 2.5 billion people rely on collective tenure rights, collectively managed lands as a source of food, fuel, and income. So this is basically a summary of some of the rationales that we wanted to present. However, it seems that few countries have still taken really concrete actions to address tenure within their climate change agendas. For example, only 7 countries with publicly available documents have mentioned tenure in their national REDD+ strategies, and 6 of these are in Latin America. And only 21 countries have done so in their nationally determined contributions. So before I finish, I just wanted to run through a few suggested measures. it's probably not going to be possible to do all of these concurrently, but depending on the context and the resources, different countries might have different priorities with these. But the first one relates to the importance of supportive legal and policy frameworks in order to make securing of collective tenure rights a more simple and efficient process. The next is a potential entry point for integrating more tenure actions in the nationally determined contributions during the next stock take in 2023. A bit far off, but something to keep in mind. And next, the importance of enhancing the capacity of stakeholders. So potentially organizing training, also keeping gender in mind and involving women in these efforts. Another very important measure would be clarifying the boundaries of collective tenure areas and partnering potentially with CSOs, introducing technologies to make this work more simple. Then another suggestion to simplify forest management obligations, so making it easier for communities to meet the requirements for sustainably managing their collective areas. And then the next three really relate to the process of securing collective tenure rights in terms of making sure to implement free, prior, informed consent, ensuring inclusive participation and gender equality, making sure that grievance redress mechanisms are accessible and responsive, and making sure that information is transparent and, for instance, not compartmentalized among agencies. And finally, the need for long-term financing. This is a key issue, and budgets need to come from both domestic and external sources. So I think there's going to be many complementary measures as well. These were just a few of the ones that we thought might be important to start with. So I'll close with that and turn it over to the next speaker so we can hear some of the country experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for being more or less on time for all this. We should stop share the screen, isn't it? Just asking confirmation yes. Here to colleagues before I do a mess here. I don't want to close the connection to the webinar. So yeah, so thanks, Amanda. We are keeping the. I know that Alice kindly informed me that there are some questions that are coming in the question and answer section. Thanks so much for that. We'll keep it as a kind of sum up of the questions also after the next panelist, so that we can also give some comprehensive answer. If some questions are easy to answer quickly, Amanda will answer during the presentation typing. Otherwise, she will answer during the Q&A session. So yeah, it's my great pleasure now to pass the microphone and the video, if possible, also to Sébastien Jedouin. You really need to apologize me for the pronunciation of your surname. Probably better if you pronounce it than to teach me how to pronounce your surname, but assistant professor at the McGill University. So thank you very much for your participation to this, and Sébastien is going to give us a nice presentation on Tanzania. Sébastien here with Amanda was a bit touching on her arm to tell her when the minute was passing. I can do the same thing with you. I'll probably stay on with the video and give you a sign when you have like 3 minutes, then 2 minutes and 1 minute. Thanks so much.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, your screen froze for a second. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone. So thank you to FAO for inviting me. I'm going to briefly discuss key findings from my book in which I compare the impacts of REDD in Indonesia and Tanzania. And if you're interested in finding out more in the announcement for the event, in my bio, I provided the link to the book because it's open access. So you can, anyone who wants, you can download it and read it for free. I just have one question. Am I the one who's sharing the slides, or are you doing that, Amanda?
Better if you do it, if you have trouble.
Okay.
But
no, okay, hold on. So
share.
Yeah, share your screen down in your, if you look down, you move your mouse,
yeah.
then on the banner, share, yeah, then you can share the screen.
Yeah, okay, hold it.
There's no
Okay.
few troubles.
Let's see if this works.
You can choose just to share the PowerPoint. So
we don't see the rest of the desktop.
Right. Okay. Huh. Said screen it said failed. So you know what? I'll just do it without the PowerPoint. It's fine.
No, we can do it. Francesca, please, can you upload while Sebastian starts talking? If from Panama my colleagues can upload the presentation. Thanks so much.
Oh, is that working for you? Because it's on my screen, but no.
We don't see
no.
it.
Okay. Well, while they're loading up the PowerPoint, I'll just start by saying, so I'm going to be discussing specifically findings in my research that relates to Tanzania today. So a very brief introduction so that you know, forests make up around 38% of Tanzania's landmass. There's most of it is dry woodlands, but there's also other forest types, such as humid mangrove forests and coastal woodlands that are quite rich in biodiversity. So that was, yeah, so that's here, the second slide on Tanzania's forest map. And as Amanda mentioned, forests in Tanzania are quite important to the livelihoods and cultural practices of rural and forest-dependent communities. So next slide, I just want to mention that in the last few decades, Tanzania's forests have been characterized by high rates of deforestation and forest degradation. And I want to mention that the main causes of forest loss have been local in nature. So the conversion of lands for agriculture. So here is an image of a coffee plantation where forests were cut down to plant this coffee plantation. Lots of biofuel production, human settlements, firewood and charcoal production, uncontrolled wildfires, illegal logging, mining, and infrastructure development. And then you have these broader drivers of forest loss in Tanzania, which include the limited capacities of the government agencies to manage forests, rapid population growth, and very high levels of poverty amongst rural communities. And the result of that is that they depend on forests to meet their basic needs in terms of income, food, and energy. In Tanzania, we have a similar finding to what Amanda mentioned, which is that forests managed by rural communities under the regime for participatory forest management have tended to be characterized by lower rates of forest loss as compared to forests managed by central authorities or those with an open access status. So the map that you're looking at now is an overview of the different main forms of forest arrangements in Tanzania. So in 2002, Tanzania adopted a Forest Act, and it enables communities that live in or adjacent to forests to control and manage or co-manage their forests. And there's two main mechanisms. So community-based forest management and joint forest management. So CBFM, which is these are the forests that are highlighted in green on the map. This allows villages to establish and manage a village land forest reserve. Whereas the GFM, what that entails is there's an adoption of joint forest management agreements between communities and central government, but that doesn't actually provide communities with statutory rights to govern the forests or access its benefits. So around 14%, between 14 and 17% of all villages in mainland Tanzania have participated in the CBFM regime. It's important to note, however, that this regime is really limited to the villages, so communities that constitute a village under Tanzanian law, and such that the four main groups that identify as indigenous in Tanzania have been excluded from this regime, and they have not been able to benefit from the CBFM historically as a mechanism. And I'm going to highlight as well that it is the policy of the government of Tanzania that all Tanzanians are indigenous, and they have not, they are traditionally rejected the concept of indigenous peoples and the fact that they might have specific rights under national law. Okay, let me move on to the next slide, which is I want to just mention that in order to establish a CBFM in Tanzania, well, a village must establish that it holds tenure over a given forest. It has to prepare a plan for its sustainable management, has to adopt bylaws, that this must be ratified by the district councils, the local government. And then after 3 years, this eventually, the villages can apply for their village forest to be gazetted by the central government. So this is a long process, it's a costly process, but at the end of it, you have clear and unambiguous statutory rights that are given to communities to manage and control forests and fully benefit from their resources. But there have been a lot of practical challenges to establishment of and management of these forest reserves. So one has been the fact that villages sometimes don't have the capacity to protect the resources in the forest from outsiders, especially those who are participating in the sort of a growing trade in illegal timber. There's also been the fact that district council officials are often reluctant to implement or approve new village land for reserve forests because, well, there's a potential loss of revenue that results from that. So this is generally regarded as one of the most advanced regimes for participatory forests in sub-Saharan Africa, but there have been obstacles to moving it forward. So in 2009, when Norway and Tanzania agreed that they would work together on implementing REDD in Tanzania, they quickly identified the idea that basically implementing the Forest Act could be a way that contribute to emissions reductions. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just mention here, so the National REDD strategy has as one of its core components the idea that if you scale up community-based forest management, accelerate participatory land use planning, and increase demarcation and mapping of village lands based on the Forest Act, that this is actually a way that you will reduce carbon emissions. On the other hand, indigenous peoples are completely ignored in this strategy. In fact, they're seen as a problem. And finally, I'll mention also there's been a huge disagreement in Tanzania over how funds channeled through REDD should be managed. So NGOs and communities preferring a nested approach where funds go internationally directly to the communities, and the Tanzanian government preferring a central fund. I'll also mention that there's a REDD safeguards policy in Tanzania, although its status is actually unclear. But basically, what's interesting about this is that it definitely requires that REDD initiatives recognize, guarantee, and respect forest-dependent communities and marginalized groups' rights to land and natural forest resources. There's also a reference to the right to pre-fire informed consent. But again, what they've done is they've taken international standards and they've removed references to indigenous peoples, which is not a concept that's accepted in Tanzania. And instead, they use the term forest-dependent communities. Okay, the other, if we go to the next slide, the last thing I want to mention is one of the main components of REDD readiness efforts in Tanzania was the initiation of 9 pilot projects across Tanzania to experiment with different interventions and figure out basically how you do this at the local level and how you could support development at a strategic level. So I did a sort of review based on, and if you go to the next slide, I'll just briefly highlight a few things. So reviewing basically independent evaluations of some of these projects, we found that 9 projects out of 11 were implemented in a manner that sought to engage with communities, that 2 projects explicitly incorporate the principle of FPIC in their design. In terms of benefit sharing, 7 projects sought to provide communities with alternative livelihoods, employment, or capacity building, and 5 successfully tested benefit sharing mechanisms. So what's most important for today is 5 of the 11 projects directly or indirectly led to the establishment of new village land use plans and village forest reserves in the CBFM or JFM plans. And so here, basically the main intervention that was pursued in these pilot projects, and many of these, was give communities collective tenure rights. And this was a way to reduce local drivers of deforestation. And I want to mention, so these were the pilot projects. There was one project that was actually funded, put together by an NGO and funded through market-based sources of funding. And this is actually the only project that worked with indigenous peoples in Tanzania. So that's kind of it. That's, to me, a very interesting result. And they are, in this project, they actually provided the indigenous Hadza people with a certificate of customary ownership, and they were certified through the Plan Vivo standard for REDD projects. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just end by saying that, I'll just end by saying that I think Tanzania shows that enhancing collective forest tenure rights can be an effective strategy for REDD programs and projects. I think this is obviously depends on effective laws and mechanisms, such as the ones that they had in Tanzania as the Forest Act, but also recognizing that you need to overcome key obstacles to make this work, including lack of resources and capacity on the part of officials and communities, and also creating incentives and other approaches for tackling corruption and capture in the local governments. And finally, very important to pay attention to the differential impacts of community forestry approaches in REDD, because as we've seen in Tanzania, for the most part, that's the CBFM regime has been developed in a way that's excluded indigenous peoples from participating. And on the contrary, you might find different results actually in Latin America, where there's greater respect for indigenous rights at the domestic level, and there may be impacts on communities that cannot fall within that approach. So that's, thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Fantastic, Sebastian. Thanks so much for the overview and the experience from Tanzania. I think it was very relevant. I hope if there are some questions that will come directly to you. I see some questions also in the Q&A section. If you feel like start typing some answer, please feel free to do so. But we'll have a specific question and answer session after the next two presentations. So Sebastian, thank you so much again, and sorry to rush away towards the next presenter. This webinar is very interesting because there are a lot of topics, but we need to keep the times quite tightly. So I would like to ask my colleagues in Panama if they can help me confirming that our dear panelist, also Ghanshyam Pandey, is available here in the
confirmed.
Thanks so
He's
much.
with us.
Okay. So before, fantastic, Ghanshyam, thank you so much for your participation. We're very happy to have you here. Before passing the floor to you, I just want to remind all the participants that actually this webinar is being recorded for the benefit of us that we are here, and we can rewatch whenever we want, and all the other persons who couldn't be connected at this stage. So after the webinar will be edited, then I will share the link for everybody to see it again. Having said so, Ghanshyam, I will give you the floor. Ghanshyam is the former president of FECOFUN in Nepal, so he will present a short and very interesting story from Nepal. As I did with Sebastian, Ghanshyam, I will chat to you to tell you more or less when the time is getting too close. It's 7 minutes time, more or less. So the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Okay, good evening and good morning, everyone. So once again, I'm Ghanshyam Pandey. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
So sound is okay.
Perfect.
So my time is evening here that I'm in home. So I'm sorry I couldn't send my presentation before, but I'll go through my verbally. I think Nepal is one of the REDD+ country which is already have developed the REDD+ strategy in Nepal. It's going to be implemented by this year. So this is a REDD+ country, Nepal. Nepal has government has done formally commitment with the World Bank and with the international community to have recognize rights of the local peoples, indigenous peoples in a coming program. So these are the positive commitment, and from perspective of the local community, we have seen there is an opportunity to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and communities informally in Nepal's forestry program. So this is one of the opportunities that we are seeing. But let me introduce about the Nepal situation, how it's moving forward. Nepal is a small country, but the land cover, the forest land is recently this forestry inventory shows that we have about 45% of the forest forest land is, and out of them, there are nearly 22,000 of community forest users groups, which are managing nearly 2.2 million hectares forest. So it seems that nearly 25% of the Nepal's forest managed by the local community. And there is a long history of that the community forestry are doing better work, and they are managing their forest. And basically the management approach of the local community forestry based on the conservation measures are very much actively done by the community. So we had started this community forestry since last 4 decades, and we have protected our forest, and that forest is now being mature. So in this situation, this is the condition of Nepal forest, and there are many researchers shows that the community protected the forest better than the government and any other forest in Nepal. So Nepal, that's why Nepal is known as the pioneer in community forestry. And there is the strong civil society organization, this umbrella organization of this 22,000 community forestry users group called the Federation of Community Forestry Users Nepal, FECOFON. So FECOFON is doing the advocacy to protect these rights of the indigenous people and local community in the community forest and management. So with these two scenarios, but I would say the current situation is a little bit change in the political system. As you may know or not, we have gone recently in the federal system. That means we have the federal structure. We have the federal government at the central level, provincial government at the province level, and local government at the local level. So due to this, the federal structure, our whole forestry policy program is in a transition. There is not much clear what role is going to play by which level of government. That's a big challenge that we have seen. So, and because of that, there is some doubt of properly implementation of REDD+ strategy at the ground level. So this is one key challenge that I have seen from my side, that whether this REDD+ strategy, which is formulated at the time of when the government is centrally active, but the situation is now we have election and we have this federal system. Because of that, so the where the community forestry falls under which government, still this is a big question, and there is that's why there is some doubt of proper implementation of REDD plan in Nepal. This is the first critical and challenge. Second is about the benefit sharing, about the investment, whether Nepal will get sufficient financial investment to implement this REDD strategy, and that implementation of REDD plus and the benefits come from the REDD plus, whether that benefits will go to community or will go to the three types of government. So this is the big challenge that we have seen in Nepal. And as a earlier discussion, there is a gender equity or participation of women, which is a very prominent issues. And I think in Nepal, we have the good women participation in community policy. And I think that will continue in coming first management system also. So I think this is some brief information about the Nepal situation, and I'm happy to respond if you have any question, because we have changed our political systems, and because of that, there is some doubt of whether this REDD strategy is going to be implemented in grassroots or not, because the central government recently highlighted about the scientific forest management rather than the scientific forest management, rather than the sustainable forest management, because REDD plus program and REDD plus strategy talked about the sustainable management of forests, but the central government policy talked more about the scientific forest management and timber production. So forestry is beyond and more than the timber. And for us, as a local community or indigenous peoples, forestry is not only the timber, it is other source of the livelihoods, other biodiversities and other things. So there is some kind of the dilemma I would like to raise some issues. And I am happy to hear from your reaction, your question. And thank you, FAO, for giving this opportunity. And yes, I will continue to this participation.
Actually, Kansham, thanks so much to you for being with us. Exactly, you say the late in the evening for you in Nepal. So thanks so much for having accepted that. Indeed, I encourage all the participants to start typing their question. I think Alice also mentioned in the chat there is a Q&A icon. If you didn't see it before, at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A icon. Please click on that and start typing your questions. One of the indicating to whom is directed the question. If the question is easy enough, the panelists might answer directly by typing, or alternatively, we have the question and answer sessions in which the panelists will answer live to your question. Kansham, thanks so much again. And I think we'll now move again from region. We went from US Tanzania to Nepal, and now we move again towards Americas, but this time Latin America. So I would like to give the floor to Ms. Deborah Delgado Pugley, a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. Deborah, ¿estás con nosotros? Sí. Super. Okay, thanks so much. Deborah, también also in your case, please keep an eye on the chat. I will chat only to you to tell you more or less how we're going with the time. So thanks again, Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, so I'm going to share my small PowerPoint. Here. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the invitation and for the initiative of discussing these very important issues. So I'm gonna present you briefly some highlights on the Peruvian case. So as you know, Peru, it's a country that has 60% of its territory on the Amazon basin. It's the second country with the biggest part of the Amazon basin in their territory, but it's just 70% of the Amazon basin as a whole. Peru represents an interesting case for analyzing the links between recognitions of indigenous territorial rights and maintenance of forest cover. we do have secure rights for indigenous peoples recognized in the Constitution, and a long history of land tenure reforms that started at the beginning of the 20th century. So there has been a lot of changes in the legal status of collective rights to land. And lately, an important move towards decentralization, and is in this context that climate policies started to interact with tenure regimes and indigenous peoples' rights. So I would like to highlight the fact that numbers might vary, but about 45% of the population of Peru can be considered indigenous. They're not all based in the Amazon basin, but the Amazon basin has a particular recognition of indigenous people's collective rights to land and resources. And 65 ethnic groups inhabit the Amazon basin of Peru. So that's to give you a context. So most of the national determined contributions recognized in Peru are based on our contribution to stop or slow deforestation in the Amazon basin, but in other ecosystems too. So there has been a big push to take action, climate action, in forested lands in the national context. This highlighted the importance of the agency of indigenous peoples and the agency of the action they take daily to take good care of their lands and forests. So this has been a very constructive context, in a context, a general context of extraction activities that take place in the Amazon basin beforehand. So there's interesting evidence on how indigenous peoples do hold a better conservation of their forests, even better than protected areas in the country. And they have been, indigenous peoples organizations have been very active on influencing supportive policies and legislations in Peru. So now we are currently having a process of consultation, not only on the law, on the climate change law, but on the regulations regarding how to operationalize this law. And indigenous peoples organizations are being very active, highlighting the importance of their contributions, not only in the Amazon basin, but on the country as a whole. Okay, so just a second. I can see the chat here. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. So, yeah. Land titling has advanced significantly in Peru, supported by the importance of the Amazon rainforest in the global effort to reduce climate change. This late effort, a contemporary effort, has basis in advances in our legal system that are pretty, that doesn't have to do with climate change policy. So it's, although the Peruvian case has very important lessons to give to the global context, it's important to highlight that we already had some legal context that was favorable to collective property rights, that are not translatable to other contexts. And we have to be very clear with that. At the same time, cohesion, social cohesion in indigenous contexts here in Peru, it's quite high. There might be some, I don't know, organic, let's say, conflicts between organizations, but anyway, the network activity between indigenous peoples, it's very high. So when we regard this case study, we should be very, we should highlight these factors, because the other countries do not have the same context. And land titling is enforcing the agency of indigenous peoples, which is a very positive element, but this also is bringing some game changer elements that might not be that positive. It's just a change in the political landscape, and we need to keep a close look to that element. Another element that I would like to highlight is Peru's national REDD strategy that recognizes very much the importance of tenure issues, and that can bring pressure and resources to address issues such as perverse incentives to deforestation. So that might be one of the key messages of this case study. REDD, it's having an interesting and important influence on land tenure and collective rights. That doesn't mean it's a positive element. It means that it gives more attention to such a pressing and important element of the agenda, social agenda of indigenous and local communities. But we have to give a close look to what would be the outcome of it. And happily, there's evidence that have been constructed over this issue, and an interesting civil society discussion on Amazonian affairs. So I would leave it there, and thank you. I can't see actually the chat, so I don't know if you tried to contact me while I was speaking, but I hope
very, very well, Deborah. I was contacting you, but you did it perfectly on time. So thanks so much for that. Okay, Deborah, thanks again, and really for staying in time, and then also for the interesting overview of Peru's situation and the linkages with REDD+. We really appreciate that. Now, one message actually to the panelists that have been talking so far: Sebastian, Ganxiam, Deborah, Amanda knows because it's next to me. We're looking at the screen. There are, if you didn't click on the icon of Q&A, you might not have seen, but there are some questions that were put to your name. So I would suggest that while I will give the floor now to our eminent commentators to provide some of their reflections on one or other of the case that was presented, the three panelists and Amanda also can scroll through the questions that were put in the specific box, the Q&A box, and identify those that were sent to you, addressed to you actually, and then I hope, and actually I was chatting with my colleague Alice to ask if there is a way of saving also the questions, those questions that will not be answered during the webinar because of lack of time. We will make our best to answer through email with a short but important answer. So yeah, again, to the panelists, please check the box of the Q&A. And in the meantime, I also ask the participants to carry on chatting the question, and I see Sebastian has the hand up. So Sebastian, yes, the microphone is, if it's on, you can, yeah.
Yeah, so I've got a question here about the idea that community-based forest management is less effective in developing countries because of, well, what's said here is people damage the forest if they're hungry. So in Tanzania, actually, the main drivers of deforestation are actually not the communities themselves that are managing the forests. It's one of the main drivers, for instance, would be they'll remove the bark from the wood for charcoal, right? And it's a source of energy. So there's actually a charcoal mafia in the suburbs of Dar es Salaam, and they will go out into these forests that they don't live in or near, and they'll remove the charcoal and sell it back. There are some communities that themselves will use the bark for charcoal, but at a much lower scale because it's just meeting their own needs. But one of the projects that I found in Tanzania that was very interesting was, well, obviously, give communities collective tenure rights, allow them to, there were resources to allow them to have bicycle patrols to protect their forest, but also give them solar cook stoves, which is very cheap, much more better for your health, a better source of energy. So anyway, the one thing I want to say is collective tenure rights are very important, but alongside of those, you need interventions to address the drivers of deforestation. And sometimes giving those tenure rights, but without giving the ability of communities to better manage their resources or to address underlying problems of poverty or to protect our resources from outsiders will not work. So you need both. You need the tenure rights, but you also need the capacity and the resources to make it work for reducing carbon emissions from forest-based sources.
Sebastian, what you just mentioned is actually also what we really strongly feel in FAO, and it's also one of the messages of the paper that Amanda was mentioning before, of this technical brief that will be shared hopefully in July publicly. But yeah, indeed, I think you really touched on the very important issue. Tenure rights are fundamental, but they are not, I mean, just by tenure rights, we will not be able to achieve our goal. There is all an enabling environment that needs to be functioning with at the same time. So thanks so much for that. Deborah and Ghanshyam, is there any specific question you would like to answer now, or should I give the floor to our eminent commentators while you think a bit on the answer? I'll give you a few seconds to see if you want to turn your mic on now. Otherwise, while you keep on thinking, I think I'll start noticing the commentators that we have in this webinar session. We're very honored, actually. We have 5 very important commentators with us. We have Raymond Samdong from Tenure Facility, Peter Veit from Land and Resource Right Initiative, WRI, yes. Mr. Alain Frechette from the Right and Resources Initiative, RRI. Ms. Nena Javeri, Natural Resources Governance and Tenure Specialist. And then Ms. Ileana Monterroso, scientist from CIFOR. I think I will go more or less in this order, while also the panelists might think about some additional answer, or please also feel free to type your answer to the question and answer box. And then also heads up to Kenneth Rosenbaum, who will actually do a wrap up at the end of this session in more or less 15-20 minutes. So yeah, maybe Raymond, if you are with us, can you turn on your video if possible and your mic, and give us 2 minutes reflection on one or the other case that was presented, or your personal sort of opinions. The floor is yours.
First, I'm very honored to be given this opportunity to make contribution to this seminar. And we raise 2 issues, and most of them have already been touched by some of the presenters. And before I do that, I just want to thank the person from Peru, and because Tenure Facility is also working on Peru, trying to get collective tenure. Yeah, one of my main contribution will be the position from the Tenure Facility, and then the second, my own professional experience working in the Congo Basin on these very issues. Yeah, for the Tenure Facility, we are mandated to support implementation of collective tenure, because we see it's quite an important issue in promoting climate and other development goals. But we also realize that this secure collective tenure is important, but it's not sufficient, because tenure is complex, it's a continuum. It also requires good governance and also incentive for livelihood, to promote community how they use this land in a more sustainable and self-sustaining issue. But with the tenure facility, our main focus is how do we measure secure collective tenure, which has not been really touched on. We look at it from starting by tracking secure collective tenure with the titling process. In terms of the titling process, it needs to be very clear. In practice, what we've observed is that it is a two-step community agreeing to map which claim the agreed boundaries. That is more of a social process. And in some of these communities, usually take times to go through this social process with the different conflicts and mediation arrangement. And we do put a lot of investment on that, so the community actually goes through and do the demarcation. And then the second aspect is the technical mapping process, which, as Amanda said, simplified spatial modern technologies can help in those processes. Then the other aspect we try to measure is the perception of tenure. This is also quite interesting but very challenging, in the sense that we try to measure how individual or group believes it's in relationship to land is safe rather than in jeopardy, and are able to appropriate resources free from imposition, despite from others outside user. So perception of tenure and titling processes are quite important instruments that we use. But in practice, we have realized that there's also a number of factors that influence these variables of tenure security, such as the legitimacy of the right, and to what extent the rights are clear, uncontested, and enforced. And if a right is accepted as legitimate, such that one that has been clearly negotiated and relevant to Australia is more likely to be respected within the two different partners or people working groups or communities. And this is quite difficult because tenure, from us, we understand it as a bundle of rights, and some of these rights overlap within this community. So it's really difficult to really measure this in practice and to show that. But just to add from my professional experience in Congo, is that—
Raymond, thanks so much. Just to ask if you can wrap up a bit so that we also can give floor to the other four commentators that we have. Maybe 30 seconds wrap up.
Yeah, 30 seconds is that I want to really pay more attention, or draw more discussion on what are the governance arrangements to secure the sustainability of this secure collective tenure. And what are the incentives to support livelihood? Because this is what this is something that has been very challenging, in the sense that if the governance or institutional arrangement are not very effective and taking into consideration the heterogeneity in these communities, then it will not be sustainable. And also, most of the livelihood support programs in conservation landscape has not been very successful in supporting communities in the DRC. So REDD plus finance be an alternative to provide incentive to sustain community that has gone through community forestry programs.
Yeah, thanks so much, Raymond. I think you also touched upon a very important point. How to connect a bit the work on incentives, and I think some of the participants were also asking some of the possibility of how actually communities can access to carbon credits or access to finance, etc. That's a very important topic also that we could discuss in a potential new webinar. There's also some work that was done last year on carbon rights. So a lot. It's very nice that it's coming up, because it's really also something that we consider is important to be discussed.
There's one way of promoting forest development enterprise, and I hope this is a quite good initiative, but sometimes usually times, like if you look at the work in Costa Rica and in Mexico, but bringing in community, it's a process, and it takes time for communities to be really empowered to promote entrepreneur business within their communities and how they are well organized.
Yeah, thanks so much, Raymond. Thanks so much for your opinions and your insight here. It's enriching a lot the conversation and we are also keeping track of what we're discussing here. Plus, in the next few weeks, I think we will compile everything to have a very nice summary of this. But I would like to pass the floor to Peter Veit. Peter, if you are with us, can you turn your microphone and video on? And again, Raymond, thanks so much. Peter, are you ready to give your 1-2 minutes inputs to the discussions that were ongoing?
Oh yeah, can you hear me okay?
Thanks so much. Go on.
Okay, let me find my notes here. Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I think all good things come in packages of 3. So I want to try to see if I have time to make 3 points. The first is that as Amanda noted, there are some NDCs that recognize the importance of tenure security and the importance of indigenous lands and community lands in climate mitigation. But we still have a long way to go. The kinds of, these kinds of efforts like the webinar and the report that will come out will further amplify these messages that indigenous people, communities have a major role to play in climate mitigation, in forest restoration, and in forest conservation as well. At the last World Bank Land and Poverty Conference a couple of months ago, PROFAR also released a major report sort of staking the World Bank's position on all of this stuff. So it's really good to see more and more attention being devoted to the role of indigenous people, communities, and tenure security. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is that there is a lot of research that's been done on the links of indigenous lands and forest conservation. Most of them have found a correlation between the two, but those correlations obviously don't necessarily give us cause and effect on the specific impacts of tenure security on forest cover change. But more recently, there has been more sophisticated economic approaches used, such as matching analysis and panel analysis, that actually allows us to get closer to cause and effect. Most of that research has been done in the Amazon, I think mainly because of the availability of data that exists there. And most of those, not all of it, but most of those have found that tenure security actually leads to better forest cover outcomes. Lower rates of deforestation, higher carbon content forests, better protected lands. And our own research has shown the same thing. Our own research in Bolivia, Colombia, Brazil, using matching analysis has found deforestation rates that are sort of 2 to 3 times lower than on similar lands that are not tenure secure. So there's a real need, I think, to use these more sophisticated approaches in other parts of the world to actually look at the effects of securing rights on forest cover outcomes. I think that my own personal feeling is that if you do this work, you will actually see very different outcomes in other parts of the world. And part of that is because I think the size of the bundle of rights will vary. And so in Latin America, for example, communities don't, indigenous people that are titled don't necessarily have the rights to commercially use their land. So I think looking at this package of incentives is really key. The last point I wanted to make, since I see I have my prompt, is a point that Raymond made, and that is the issue of how to secure tenure rights for communities. And there are many ways to do that: mapping and more supportive legislation, monitoring and controlling of land, so on and so forth. But approach that has been used more, that's getting a lot of attention, is the registration of customary rights into a cadastre and the issuing of a title or a certificate. CIFOR and WRI and RRI have done research recently to show that that procedure is often complex, cumbersome, expensive, time-consuming, and they're often outcompeted by companies that can do this much quicker. So there's a real need, I think, to streamline the process of titling to allow communities to get more of their titles. If 17 or 18% of the world's land is legally recognized as belonging to them, far less of that land is actually titled. So there's a real need to streamline that approach. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for your very important insight, but also for having kept an eye on my gestures and on the chat. So thanks a lot for that. We're very very honored to be able to listen to all the commentators, and that's why I really wanted to rush from one to another, but also to remind the participants, if you have some questions also to the commentators, in addition to the panelists, please feel free to do so again on the Q&A box. Again, just to reinforce that if the questions will not be answered during this webinar, because we just have 15 minutes left, we will answer remotely with emails. So yeah, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Alain Frechette. Alain, are you ready to your couple of minutes reflection on what has been discussed so far, and what is your overall thoughts on collective tenure rights?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for bringing me into this important conversation. I'm very, very happy, pleased to be part of this. And in fact, would like to start by congratulating you and REDD for making this possible, and also for investing time and energy into this important topic. Unfortunately, REDD up to date has not invested much in terms of resources and on this important issue, and so I commend you for that. Following Peter's lead, I'd like to, I guess, focus on three things to keep it short and focused. But first, start by indicating small nuances in the data that Amanda gave us at the onset of the webinar. She mentioned 17% of communities, 17% of the carbon is managed by communities. In fact, that is true. That is true in terms of at the global level. For tropical and subtropical countries, we're talking about 22%. All of these numbers stem from research that Woods Hole Research Center, WRI, EDF, RI, and others have put together over the past few years, the latest research being a report that we put out last year. And more importantly, all these numbers are low estimates. We know that the actual amount of carbon managed by these communities is far greater. So on to my 3 points. I think the first thing that needs to be mentioned is that forests managed by communities, and this is something that Peter emphasized, forests managed by communities with secure rights tend to experience far lower rates of deforestation, store more carbon, harbor more biodiversity, and benefit more people than forests managed by either governments or private entities. There's a lot of documentation that has gone on to this, and more analysis, such as this one, the report that Amanda and colleagues have put together, shines a light on this. The other critical point that bears mentioning is that there are actually very few governments to date that prioritize securing community rights as part of their REDD+ strategies or NDCs. In fact, when you look at the data, there are only a handful of countries that mention investment in securing rights as part of their climate strategies. And most REDD+ engagements to date around the world have been around making communities calling upon them as participants, as beneficiaries, but not as clear stakeholders in rights holders in being able to implement the changes that are needed on the ground to secure and protect the world's forests. And finally, the last point that I wanted to make is that far more research, financing, and technical support is needed in order for the world to dramatically scale up rights. The case for community rights, which is often even raised in the questions that are participants are mentioning here, constantly needs to be updated and reinforced. Human rights, community rights, the case for community rights stands on three grounds. First, the human right aspect, so it's having secure rights to land and resources is a basic human right that needs to be recognized, so that's the primary reason why we do this. The other one, there are development outcomes in terms of securing community rights. The economic case for securing community rights is not yet robust, and we do need to work on this. But alongside with this, many instances, communities face regulatory policy roadblocks that prevent them from engaging. And then finally, there is the environmental rationale for securing rights. And what we see across the world is that not enough money from climate financing institutions is being directed towards efforts to secure and scale up community rights. Experience from the Tenure Facility shows how dramatic investing small amounts of money directly to communities can dramatically change the situation and secure their rights far more than anything else that we've experienced thus far. So anyway, I see that I'm being asked to wrap up, so I'll stop there for now.
Alan, thanks so much. The discourse was so interesting and captivating that I didn't interrupt you immediately. It was very, I think your reflection on REDD+ also was very pertinent. I think when the process REDD+ started in 2008, long time ago, probably it started with the wrong foot. If we think about engagement, but those were the very first years, a lot of negotiations ongoing and a lot of efforts from different reasons, from different point of view, from the countries, from the international organizations, etc. I think luckily after 10 years, plus than 10 years, there have been some progress with respect to the engagement of communities and LIPs in the REDD+. Of course, the process itself can't really solve all the issues. It has a lot of, it has improved on its own steps, I think. Still a long way to be perfect. Maybe I can use this also to advertise a bit in the UN REDD newsletter that is going to come up in a couple of weeks. There's actually a perspective piece on what you just mentioned, Alan, and how REDD+ kind of evolved in this engagement of communities, engagement of indigenous people, actually putting them at the center of the the story, which was not the case at the beginning. So very nice to know that it improved a bit, and I know that the process needs to proceed much more in that direction. Nena, if you are there, Nena Javari from Nepal, I know that you're sitting in India also, so it must be quite late now. But if you're still with us, thanks for your time and availability in the evening. Nena, the microphone is yours for a couple of minutes of reflection, and then again to encourage the panelists and the commentators to have a look at the Q&A box. And feel free to answer, actually, please answer the questions that are coming in. There are some interesting questions there. Nena, are you there?
Yep, good evening. I hope you can hear me fine.
Yes.
I'm not going to turn my video on just to save the internet.
Okay. Thanks.
My comments are really directed largely at the Nepal experience, broadly in terms of community forestry, but also in relation to REDD+. So I think as Ghanshyam, correctly points out, that the whole situation is in a tremendous state of flux because of federalism and the move towards devolution of government. So as he says, there's a lack of clarity as to which level of government holds primary rights when it comes to community forestry arrangements. But I think also, in addition to that very important layer, there are probably two other important layers to consider in terms of the rollout of REDD+ projects. So I think the first one is really the history of the rollout of CFUGs within Nepal in a geographical sense. So here, what I mean to say is that we need to look at the political economy of the forest sector. So community forestry in Nepal largely rolled out in its initial years within the Middle Hills, which is the sort of central belt across the country. And CFUGs, the community forestry user groups, tried to be established in the Tarai, which is the lowland belt between Nepal and India. But there was a lot of contestation and conflict within the zone. So whereas it moved quite quickly and relatively successfully, particularly with the help of FECAFUN, the network of community forestry in the Middle Hills, in the Tarai, FECAFUN worked hard to expand it in this area. But there was a pushback from the government and other interests. And the primary reason for this is because the Middle Hills has a certain kind of forest ecology and a transportation network that doesn't really enable a rapid timber extraction. Whereas in the Tarai, you have extremely valuable hardwood salved forests that are readily accessible and for which there's tremendous value in the market. And so we've seen this state of conflict and accommodation emerging within the Tarai. But the Tarai is also the area in which the government and others have proposed one of the large REDD+ projects in Nepal through the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility in 12 what were called districts in that area. And one of the goals of the government in sort of proposing this area was to be able to continue the devolution of forestry to CFUGs. So although on the one hand, the government has played a role in holding back the expansion of CFUGs, but they're using the opportunity of REDD+ and possible financing to continue devolution in that fashion. So it'll be very interesting, and I think Ghanshyam maybe can say more on this, which is how does he see this state of contestation, and he himself at the moment is the mayor of CIFOR, which is in the Tarai. But this issue of the value of the forest, I think, is key in terms of how governance arrangements work. And on a smaller note, I'm going to end here, is that there has been massive outmigration of people from Nepal, from the mid-hills, but also from the Tarai, mostly men, but some women. And this has left a situation in which local governance increasingly is moving into the hands of the elderly and women. And therefore, there's quite a significant change in terms of the gender relations and governance arrangements as a result. And so because of the remittances that are coming back from the migrants, there's been a shift away from the use of the forest for fuel wood towards natural gas and so on. So there's quite a huge dynamic context in which tenure arrangements are operating. So I'm going to end on that note in the interest of time, but I think these are the two other layers to think about in terms of how tenure really works on the ground in a collective sense. Thank you.
Nena, thanks so much, and please accept my apologies if I don't pronounce your name again correctly. But thanks also for having brought a bit the topic of gender in the discussion. I think this is also a very, very important point to be taken into consideration. There was also one specific question on gender in our chat. Amanda is our tenure expert, also gender expert, so she will type in the answer either later today or through email. In the interest of time, I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Ileana Monterroso, a scientist in CIFOR. I think your comments are going to be more related to Peru, Ileana, but if you want also to expand a bit more, you can, but in a couple of minutes time. Ileana?
Okay, thank you, Amanda, and thank you everybody for the discussion. It's been quite interesting to hear about all these experiences. And I would also like to highlight 4 issues, drawing on the case of Peru, but also drawing on a broader research work that we have been carrying out during the last 5 years in Uganda and Indonesia as well. And some relates, it's overlaps with REDD context. So the first point that I would like to make is that it's important to understand the type of tenure interventions that we're encountering in REDD context. So much of what we have been hearing about today, it's about, interventions that are addressing clarification issues whenever rights are not clear. So titling certificates are an example of this, but also there are type of interventions that are important to identify are those that are drawing on situations where tenure security or conflict situations, tenure conflict is also emerging. And I think that in the Peru case, it's an important case that allows us to learn what happens beyond clarification issues. So what happens after titling, what happens after we have formalized rights. And one key issue that it's relevant in the case of Peru, but also in the broader context of Latin America is the role of mobilization of local communities. And I think that makes a very big difference whenever we analyze Latin America against other contexts where mobilization for indigenous and local communities have really made the case to make sure that REDD strategies take into account tenure issues. And it's also related to the need to go, in the case of Peru, going beyond what happens when we get the rights, how do we actually benefit from it? So addressing livelihoods. And I guess I would also suggest another example in terms of other interventions, REDD interventions that are incorporating tenure issues. And I wanted to highlight the example of dedicated grant mechanisms. We have around 14 countries that are starting and implementing dedicated grant mechanisms, and how some of those DGMs are actually incorporating tenure interventions around clarification, security, or conflicts such as DRC, Indonesia, Brazil, in addition to Peru. My second point would like to go back to one of the issues that was raised by Amanda in her presentation. And I think that even beyond the need of supportive and legal policy frameworks, one very key issue that we need to look into when looking into how REDD interventions are addressing tenure, it's looking into implementation practices. I think implementation practices are showing an important enabling condition. And by this, we are all issues that relate to overlapping situations where we have 2 different right holders claiming rights over the same resource, coordination, the need to coordinate among the different government institutions in charge of implementing and addressing conflict. And in fact, this issue of conflict is also related to the redress mechanisms and grievance mechanisms that was also raised during the presentation, but also in other cases. And I would like to make one final point before wrapping up. And I would like to go back to this discussion of women. And in particular, I think the gender issues in the context of collective tenure regimes is highly relevant, especially because what we have seen in practice from research is that we have situations, women, social differentiation, not only for women, but also minorities, ethnic groups, and other poor, more vulnerable groups can be affected during implementations if we are not making sure that implementation practices, that government institutions have the capacities to address women and other different groups' concerns in regards to implementations, but also looking into the governance mechanisms that exist the rules and how these rules may benefit or not take into account different concerns within the collective. And in regards to REDD, what we have seen from research is the need to look into how REDD interventions are taking into account or not avoiding, not overloading women's concerns in terms of labors, in terms of time. So, you know, going back to the need to look into the governance mechanisms as an important successful mechanisms to make these interventions work. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Juliana. Muchísimas gracias. It's a pity that every time that panelists and commentators see our faces appear, they have fear. So I hope we can meet live, so to see that we're not so dangerous. But thanks so much, and thanks, Ileana, also for having brought again the attention on gender. That's very important. We perfectly know that that's not the only thing that we need to do by counting number of kind of speakers and stuff, but just a curiosity. Indeed, in this webinar, we're 3 and 3. We're actually 6 and 6. Sorry, not 3 and 3. We're actually 6 women and 6 men who are kind of in the main roles in this webinar. So we're just counting. So that's nice, actually. But we know that it goes way beyond just counting men and women. I would like to thank everybody for these very exciting discussions. We're nearly done now. We went out maybe 5 minutes out of what we thought. Also would like to stress again, we're very happy that we started with a lot of participants. We still have 50 participants with us. That's really, really nice for us. And it means a lot of discussions, a lot of questions being asked and answered in the box. Also, I would like to take this occasion to thank again Alice, who's been helping us with the Zoom technology. That was very, very useful. Now, before closing, 2 more things. One, we need your answer now for a poll, for a sort of evaluation, questions that Francesca will put up again, in sense of trying to help us helping you. Basically, as I was mentioning at the beginning, this is the first webinar of the discussion group, but we will do many more, hopefully. And so if Francesca can put up the poll, maybe we can give time, pass you the microphone, Franci, you can explain, and then Kenneth will give a wrap up and closure. So with this, I think this is the last time I will take the microphone. Maybe a warm thank from myself and from Amanda. Thanks again to everybody. Francesca, and then Kenneth.
Thank you, Serena, Amanda, and colleagues from the webinar. As Serena was saying, actually, as this is going to be like the first of a series of webinar, we would like to know from your side which one you think would be the most interesting topic which could come next. Before mentioning the ones that are here, I just want to remember that you also mentioned the relevance, for example, to enhance or have more clarity on carbon tenure rights linked to collective lands, and the gender topic also was very strong. So here beforehand, we identified like a couple of themes which we thought could be of interest. I think the first one it has been reflected in your comments, and it would be to focus on the need to empower or strengthen the empowerment of rural and indigenous women depending on forests. This aspect could focus, for example, on strengthening the leading role that women may have in the context of agroforestry productive organizations, or in the context of the governance structures which are in place at national or subnational level, for example. The second topic would be to center on community-based monitoring of forests. We have seen we centered today on the discussion on tenure rights, but we know that we need other tools in order also for communities to be empowered and for them to be to have a leading role in monitoring their forests. We think would be very, very relevant. We have 2 very good examples, one from Panama and Colombia, where we have been working during those last years. The third one would be on integrating a human rights-based approach in REDD+ processes. It could be related, in general, as we discussed, the forest law, or if we focus on specific tools which are needed for REDD+ to be implemented, such as the national forest inventories. Here, for example, the idea would be to consider communities as right holders instead of only potential beneficiaries of projects. And we may also focus on access rights to natural resources, such as access to land and water. And here also we can have a strong focus on gender. The fourth one could be on exploring the nexus between forestry and agriculture. We know that one of the main drivers of deforestation is agriculture, and between our team, REDD+ team in headquarters, we are developing also a paper focused on that. The next one would be to focus on integrating indigenous knowledge and practices in REDD+ planning. So how we could strengthen further the role of indigenous people, and in order to ensure, for example, that their ancestral practices are considered when we implement and plan REDD+. And then we give a space if you want to add other like themes. They are most welcome, and we will be glad later on to have a look on that. But I think we have already here some results from your side. I can see that the first one is the one that has got the more like focus from your side. So I think we can elaborate a bit more in order to focus on the subjects, but definitely we think and we agree that the role of women, rural and indigenous women, depending on forests, is very relevant in the forest sector, and to strengthen climate mitigation actions on the ground. So thank you very much for that. I think that next we can have the wrap-up session now from Ken. And again, as being part of the UNRED team, I would like to thank the attentions of all the participants until the end of this session.
Ken, yes, perfect. Ken, the floor is yours.
Hi, I guess I'm on.
It's fantastic. Thanks, Ken. The floor is yours.
Well, I'd just like to, first of all, continue or extend the thanks to everyone, to the 12 people who served as speakers and panelists, to the amazing amount of planning that went into this from Amanda and Francesca, and the technical support of Alice, and the holding, the moderation of Serena. Thank you very much. It's been an amazing 100 minutes. To think that we have flown around the world, heard from people from, I think, 5 continents, seen case studies on 3, and learned about this problem from so many perspectives. We've seen that it's got social perspectives, that it's got economic perspectives, political perspectives, governance perspectives, that there are issues of capacity, that there are issues of resources. It is not a simple problem. And yet it is an area, we've also heard that it's an area where there's great promise to actually accomplish things in terms of carbon sequestration and mitigation of climate change. And what's most exciting really is to see that we've had as many as 70 people online at once, and basically a core of 50 people who've stuck us through over the allotted time. And not just any people, but people who are smart and dedicated, and have really shown us that they have the commitment to address, to learn about, and eventually solve these kinds of problems. So to all of the people who are online and have joined us, our special thanks. And we do this for you, and we look forward to doing this for you again. Thank you. And can I hand it back to Serena or Alice to close us off?
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I think your closing was perfect. I didn't want to add any more things because your closing was perfect. So thanks again to everybody. I think we can, depending on which part of the world you are now, you can either go for a nice aperitif or for lunch. Or thanks again to everybody. Alice, whenever you want, I think we can close this. Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.